Thank you very much. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this conference. It's an honor to be here and a pleasure to be spending time with all of you and my colleagues in particular from SPARC Japan. The title of the talk today is Enabling Open Research, and what I'll do is cover three things. Really using the movement towards open access and the progress and the challenges to adoption of open access to scholarly literature and articles in specific as one way of looking at the challenges that face open science as a whole. We consider open access to articles to be a primary pillar of open science. It's just one part of the whole open science ecosystem, but for us it's a very important piece of the puzzle. And I'll focus on open access primarily because SPARC is a global coalition of academic and research libraries whose mission is to make open the default in research and education. And when we say make open the default, we mean when you walk onto a university or college campus, we want you to think about that you will share the results of the research that you conduct and the materials that you use to teach, unless or until someone gives you a compelling reason not to. And that's essentially the opposite mode that we have right now. At SPARC in North America, our primary focus is on supporting an open research ecosystem by opening up access to the materials that scholars and scientists most desperately need in order to do their work. Articles, research data, and educational materials like textbooks, courseware, syllabus, and learning objects. And you would think, as we all would, that in 2018, with the beautiful platform of the World Wide Web and the internet at our fingertips, that we would have unfettered access to everything that we possibly need to be able to do effective science, effective research, effective scholarship automatically. We have, with the advent of network digital technology, access to so much more information and opportunities to do so much more with that information. It should be easy for us. But that's theoretically. I think there's no one in this room who doesn't understand that despite the promise of the World Wide Web, of the internet, the materials that we most desperately need the freedom to be able to work with, to do good research and do good science, remain laden. They're overlaid with very restrictive policies, access barriers, pricing barriers, and barriers to actually using and reusing information in the digital environment. And because we're the library community, because SPARC is a membership organization of libraries, part of a major way that we began to think about wanting to change and needing to change the current status quo came to us in the form of dealing with financial barriers, right? The cost of getting information, access to information to our colleagues on campuses, and primarily to journals. And this is just a snapshot of average journal prices in US dollars from 2016. And you can just see how expensive it is to lease access, to essentially rent access to a year's worth of articles in a journal in a particular discipline. The average is around $1,700 US, which is an enormous amount of money to pay for 1 year's worth of access to a set of articles. The costs are not insignificant on an individual title level, but what's really important to understand is that cumulatively, this is an enormous business, right? These journals, access to these journals and profits made from these journals are roughly a $10 billion a year revenue producing industry. So think about the scope of the barriers and the financial burdens that are in front of the folks who want to get access to this material, and people like librarians who are tasked with getting access for our campuses to these materials. The cost barriers are not just theoretical barriers, right? It's a lot of money, it's expensive, but don't our libraries get us access to everything that we need? Don't we have, the ability to pay and get the kind of access that we need? Right? We're not hearing, as Professor David pointed out to me over lunch, we don't see faculty members protesting in front of the university buildings because they're feeling a lack of access to primary articles. Well, what's interesting is they do feel this lack of access, and we see this every day. I think there's not a researcher or a person in this audience who hasn't run into this kind of a scenario. You're doing research on a topic that's of interest to you. You do a Google search to look for articles that you may want to use to inform the science, the study, the research that you're doing. You find an article that is of interest to you. My son happens to have type 1 diabetes, so I'm constantly looking for the most up-to-date information about how to keep his blood sugar from going low overnight. You find an article that you think might be of interest to you. You read the abstract. Sounds good. I think I'll take a look at it. But when you try to access the full text of the article, you run into a paywall. You run into a request to pay an additional sum of money for that article. And I don't think that is there anybody in the room who hasn't had this happen to them? Right? No one raises their hand. Yeah. I think it happens to all of us. What's really interesting, though, is we're not protesting, right? We're not saying this is a huge problem on our campuses. What we're doing is I think, informative and very, very important for us to understand in terms of changing behavior towards moving into open. Here's what we hear most frequently that people do. Well, here's what we hear less frequently. As librarians, we would love if the first answer that you gave us is, I immediately called my librarian and asked to get a copy of the article through interlibrary loan. Sometimes that happens, but much more frequently, what we see is people will respond, oh, I went directly to the author. I emailed the author and asked for a copy. Yeah, a lot of head shaking. Or I went to a colleague at another institution who I know has a subscription to that and got a copy. A lot of our younger students and early career folks are using the hashtag ICanHasPDF and asking for copies on Twitter to look for copies of articles that they need. Very creative. We're starting to see people create small apps that are searching repositories and searching the web for copies that are free of articles that are behind paywalls. And what we're really seeing is an enormous black market of pirated articles springing up. So Sci Hub is a database that is a completely illegal database of 58 million pirated scholarly journal articles that, as you can see from the illuminated pieces of red, Science Magazine did a study to see who was accessing these illegal articles and where were they coming from. They're coming from all over the world. This is a problem that's under the surface. Even though we may not be protesting on our campuses, we're certainly seeing the net effects in our daily lives, right? What's worse, even the behaviors that say, well, I'll try to circumvent copyright and I'll get an illegal copy of articles, what we hear over and over again from scientists, from scholars, from researchers, is when I hit that paywall, I automatically do a little calculus in my head, and I make the decision that I'm going to skip that article and go on to something that I have access to, rather than make the effort to try to find a free copy of that article. That means we end up doing science and doing research on what we have access to, rather than what we might actually need to know. And what's worse, we end up teaching our students and providing information to other people based on what we have access to, rather than what they might really need to know. We're essentially operating, and we've been operating, even in this beautiful internet-enabled world, in a system that forces us into workarounds to try to get the basic information that we need to do good science and good research. And I think it's really important as we think about getting into open, and open as a potential solution, that we recognize that it's not just getting access to these materials, these digital materials, that's important. We want to be able to access these digital articles and underlying data and be able to use them fully and freely in the digital environment. As an example, when a discipline, as almost all disciplines are now, move into more digital conduct of research, as happened in genetics and genomics with the digitization of the human genome, you end up with a corresponding increase, a huge increase, an exponential increase in the amount of attendant data and information that we need to deal with. So you see the curve when the genome was digitized in the late 1990s, the amount of data that was deposited into GenBank, which is a genome database, went up on an exponential curve. What's important to know is that's not special to genomics. Every discipline that moves into a more digital operations environment has seen and is seeing this kind of increase in information. What's critical to remember, though, is that our ability as individual humans and as individual scientists to deal with this information has stayed the same. My friend Cameron Nayland likes to look at the slide and say, I am being asked to deal with so much more information, yet I only have one brain, right? What that means is we really need to enable computers as a category of readers on scientific and scholarly articles and the attendant data that's underneath them, right? Simply to make sense out of the increased and increasing amount of information that we have in front of us, right? We want to be able to text and data mine and do computational analysis, not just on a subset of articles, not just the ones we can get access to, but all articles, everything that we might need to inform our work and to truly unlock the power of the information that's contained in this digital material. And as was mentioned earlier, we also are operating increasingly in environments, and I will say from personal experience in the United States, political environments, where the validity, the value of science is in question by our current administration. We want to be able to demonstrate the validity of conclusions in articles. We need access to the articles as data and the underlying data to verify, to reproduce, to validate the efficacy, the truthfulness of science on a regular basis. Really important. So what we're talking about and what we talk about at SPARC all the time as a motivation to try to move our community into an open access and open research environment is what we're talking about doing is really thinking about optimizing the system of sharing the results of research and attendant educational materials to better suit the needs of the folks who are doing the science and who are using the science. And I should say science and scholarship, because we're talking about open science in this symposium. At SPARC, we're talking about open scholarship. We believe digital humanities, social sciences, the work that's done on our campuses in education writ large benefits from utilizing the strategies of making things fully accessible and fully reusable. So this idea, and many of you in the room are familiar with this, the concept of open access, but this is the driver behind what caused the concept of open access to research literature to be first put together. 15 years ago already, getting old as I'm standing here, a group got together, was convened by the Soros Foundation in the Budapest Open Access Initiative to talk about doing exactly what I just mentioned. If we could build and conceive of a system for researchers, researchers to share the outputs of their research fully and freely and allow people to use them to its fullest, what would that look like? What would we need to do to make that happen? So the idea of open access was coined during the Budapest Open Access Initiative. And it talked about exactly what I mentioned in the beginning of my talk. It talked about bringing the new technology of the internet together with the tradition of scientists and scholars freely sharing with each other their ideas, the results of the research that they were producing, and bringing these two things together for the first time to really make possible a powerful and unprecedented public good, something that would have a net positive effect on not only science, individual scientists, but societies as a whole. And the public good that open access makes possible is, in essence, the immediate free distribution and availability of this material on the open web, completely unrestricted to anybody, any scientist, scholar, teacher, student, or member of the public, any curious mind who wants to access this material. This material is quoted directly out of the Budapest Open Access Initiative, which SPARC was privileged to be at the table and help to draft this statement. What Budapest also did, though, that was really important and is really important as we think about enabling an open research environment, was to not only say, hey, this is a great lofty goal, this is something to aspire to, but it outlined the definition, the framework of how to get there, right? When we're talking about opening access, making things free, well, open means different things to different people. For open access and for open access to the materials we need to do science and research, the definition in the Budapest, the BOAI, the Budapest Open Access Initiative, is very specific. We want to not just be able to get to an article and read it in PDF form on the web, but rather we want to be able to get to that article freely and be able to use it as the digital data that it is on the open web to download, bulk download, text and data mine, distribute, crawl for indexing, use for any legal purpose under the sun. The shorthand and the important thing to remember about open in terms of the materials that we need in an open research environment is that open access is a two-part definition, right? A free online accessibility coupled with the rights to use that material fully in the digital environment. We don't have true open and true openness in open science or in open research without having this definition fully realized. And what's been really important as we at SPARC have continued to try to move the needle in this direction on our campuses and with our researchers is that how we talk about open matters. And that if we simply say to researchers and to scholars, to funders, to publishers, to all folks who are important players in the science and research ecosystem, we should all push for open access because open is good or open is better than closed, or we're open access advocates and it makes us sound like all we really care about is open. But that's not really it, right? We want folks to really understand that we're not asking for an open science system and an open access system because open is better than closed. But we want to use open, this openness, this free accessibility and the full utility as an enabling strategy in order to enable each one of us to make the kind of progress that's important to us in our daily work. Whether we're a scientist, a student, a funder, we need to think about what can open do to help me achieve my end goal more efficiently. And the crazy thing was we knew this when the Budapest Open Access Initiative was drafted, right? We had the aspirational goal of the system set out. We had the framework for how to get there, the definition set out, and we actually talked about open in order to accelerate research, enrich education, share the learning of the rich with the poor and the poor with the rich, make this literature as useful as possible, and lay the foundation for uniting humanity in a common intellectual conversation and quest for knowledge. Open in order to do all of these things, not open because open's better than closed. Now we're starting to talk, when we're talking with researchers on our campuses, why should you participate in making materials open, right, in the open research environment? Opening up access to research data in order to share your data more quickly so we can prevent a potential mosquito-borne pandemic like the Zika virus from spreading. Opening up access to your research data or the articles in order to improve transparency and reproducibility. right? Finishing that sentence, putting yourself in the shoes of the person who you're talking to, and understanding that open can be an enabling strategy for them to achieve something that's important to them. At SPARC, we work on all aspects of opening up access to materials in this ecosystem, and that includes textbooks, right? Opening up access to textbooks in order to make higher education more affordable to all students. So this idea of filling in the blank of open in order to, for those of you who participate in Global Open Access Week, it'll be familiar to you as this was the theme of 2017's Open Access Week. We asked the community to think about talking to folks and using this sentence and getting people to fill in the blanks. And what we really wanted to try to do was to draw out of stakeholders that are so important to the ultimate success of an open science and open research enterprise, to get them invested, to recognize why open could be an important strategy for them to use. And we had some wonderful results. This is a picture of a chalkboard in the lobby of the Gates Foundation, which is, as you know, is an enormous private foundation providing funding for research based in the United States. And in their lobby during Open Access Week, they drew this on the chalkboard and asked their grant makers to come in and fill in the blanks on the chalkboard. What can open access do for you? What can it do for us as a research funder? Why should we support open access? And the Gates Foundation folks actually filled in the blank. They have an enormous investment in their global health initiative in public health. Their open in order to sentence said, the Gates Foundation supports open access in order to save lives through our funding of global health, our global health initiative. So they really saw themselves in the end game. Funders embracing open and understanding the power of open is an enormously important piece of effectively enabling an open research enterprise. The World Bank also participated in Global Open Access Week, and they filled in the open in order to this way. Part of their core mission at the bank is to end extreme poverty. They're opening up access, fully opening up access to all of their publications and data. Over the last 5 years, they've adopted an open access policy in order to help them achieve this portion of their core mission. So bringing in the source of research funding into the under the open tent, or getting them to understand the importance of openness, is something that we've been working very hard on doing. This is our former vice president in the United States. I miss him. But I don't just have his picture up here because I miss him. He's a great example, although I do. He's a great example of somebody who came to understand the power of open and open science intuitively when his son was diagnosed with a brain tumor. Vice President Biden talked about coming to the realization that he wanted to move his son from one treatment facility in the United States to another to get an experimental treatment. The first research facility had to transfer the brain scans, the electromagnetic scans, to the other research facility. And he was told, the vice president was told, it would take 24 to 48 hours for those scans to be read, because the data was in a format that the other research institute didn't have. They had to do a conversion. And Vice President Biden gave a speech to the American Association of Cancer Researchers where he talked about the unconscionable delay of 48 hours of having to translate data from one format to another. He didn't understand what he was talking about was interoperability, using standards, making sure that our scientific data is in a format that can be openly and easily, immediately read and fully reused. But that's what he was getting to intuitively. And then he further in the speech to the cancer researchers said, and it's not just this data that's important and that we should have in a form and in a way that's available on day one. It's the articles that talk about the insights into the data that we need access to immediately. And he just came to that organically, open in order to speed up our progress towards treatments and potentially a cure for a specific condition or disease. Love him. We've been collecting, and I think this is important for us as a community who are committed to open. If you're interested in looking at other people's examples, what they've said, right? Those are just three kind of high-profile examples. There is the website is called Open in Order 2. That's just the URL. And there's a collection of stories that we put together over Open Access Week to help folks in the community who are talking about open science and open research have a little bit more material to help have conversations with whoever you're talking to that can be a little bit more effective in this arena. So all of this sounds great. Sounds pretty good. We're making progress. Open is within our grasp. But I think it's really important for us to look at why we're not in the perfect, we've been talking about it for 15 years, but we're not there yet. And why is that? A lot of people will say, look, it's all the commercial publishers' fault. They're the big bad, folks. They don't want us to have open access. And yeah, there's pushback from commercial publishers to a certain degree, for sure. That's part of the issue, but it's not the main issue. The main issue is that we still have individual scholars and researchers who are not convinced or don't understand that moving into an open science or open research environment is optimal. And it's probably no surprise. Even if people are aware that there are options to share articles openly, they often don't know, how can I tell if this is a real open access journal? Is this truly an open access journal? And we don't make it easy on them figuring out whether or not something is open access when we say, well, if it has a Creative Commons license, a CC BY license, it's open. They go to Creative Commons and they see all of these options for licenses and they say, well, it's a CC BY NC SA license. Does that mean it's open? It's very confusing. We're asking them to learn essentially another shorthanded legal language to know whether or not the option that they're picking is truly an open option or not. We've had, as I'm sure you are all aware, a real influx of opportunistic players, sometimes called predatory publishers, who are preying upon the idea that many open access journals use article processing charges where authors pay a fee to publish their articles. And researchers tell us we get emails, 5 to 10 emails a week, asking us to publish our article in journals that we know are fake, and that makes them think open access is a fringe thing. It's not legitimate. It's not okay to publish in open access journals. They're confused about what to do with their data, right? We're trying to provide mechanisms to help understand if you want to make your data openly available or share your data, here are ways to do it. But they say, we're still confused. Where should we put it? So many details to try to understand. But the main thing that I want to talk about 3 things that we're focusing on to finish up, that we're focusing on to be able to really make progress. The main thing that researchers tell us that they're worried about is, I'm not rewarded for making my research outputs openly available the same way in tenure, in promotion, in funding, and evaluation as I am for continuing to just publish in journals that have high impact factors, right? And this is something that we have to grapple with and deal with head on. So we have institutional incentives that don't reward the creation and use of open materials and practices. And these institutional incentives are on our college and university campuses, as well as in our funding bodies, public and private funding bodies. So I want to close by just giving 3 suggestions for how we might address the problems that are still clearly in front of our researchers, and problems that we are having in trying to move into the open environment. Right? 1, no mystery. We need to realign the incentives that underpin our scientific and scholarly communications practices to contribute those that are contributing to the core mission of the university. If we look at university mission statements or funding agency mission statements, we often see that they contain lots of direction about the diffusion of knowledge, where we exist in order to share knowledge widely or push the knowledge that's created on our campus out into the world, engage the public. And yet we're rewarding publication, our incentives are rewarding publication oftentimes in outlets that are not reaching the widest possible audience. So we need to realign those incentives and reward behaviors that actually move the university or the funder in the direction of that core guideline. Too many tenure and promotion guidelines in the US and around the world look like this. The first column, you're rewarded for publication in 10 to 15 journals with an average impact factor of X or above, right? There's no mention of the audience that it reaches, of the utility of your work in the digital environment, right? That needs to change. We need to look at recreating, realigning incentives to better support open. And think about, it's different in different disciplines. Like how we get there will be different in genetics and genomics as in other disciplines. Think about what those kinds of rewards and behaviors could look like in your disciplines. We can think about doing things like employing article level metrics that trace all kinds of downstream uses and potential impact and incorporating those in the evaluation process. I'm not saying replace impact factor with alternative metrics necessarily, but supplement them. We should have additional measures that reward the behaviors of open sharing of materials. Research funders, and I just want to mention this, in the United States, private funders play a very important role, and they're playing an increasingly important role right now as our federal government wrestles with the importance of science and continued funding of science. Private foundations in the US provide a lot of money to our campuses to continue to do research. And they're beginning to adopt the idea of open as an enabling strategy, as the Gates Foundation has, as core to helping them achieve their primary missions. The Open Research Funders Group is a group of funders that SPARC has been helping to convene for the last 2 years, comprised of some of the largest private funders of research in the United States and beginning to be in the world. They are looking at ways to say, hey, we're supporting research. We want to leverage the return on that investment. We believe opening up access to the results, the data, the articles of that research will help us achieve our missions. Now we want to work with you in higher education to talk about realigning incentives to make this more of a possibility. I think this is a very promising strategy to begin to move the needle towards open. The second thing that I posit that we really need is we need to rethink the business models that support open access publications, but also open access outputs in general. It's really important that we remember and recognize in the models that we create that scholarship science is a global enterprise. I think our first two speakers really illustrated the global nature of the research enterprise and the need for us to make sure that when we're building the financial models that support open sharing, particularly of journals, that we make sure that those models both support the local knowledge creation and encourage contributions in developing countries, from smaller institutions, from all over, from all different types of contributors, as well as reward global dissemination, right? So the main thing that I'm thinking about is there's been a push lately for the open access community to think about making a large-scale transition to flipping from supporting subscription-based journals to article processing fee-based journals. And that's an interesting model that will get us to having more open access articles, but we have to think about the, 5 minutes, perfect. We have to think about the real effect that will have on those countries who currently can't afford to pay subscriptions and are being shut out of accessing science. They're not going to have the money to be able to pay to publish their articles in open access journals, we move to a problem of participation in science. And that is not something that we want to encourage. So thinking about equity and fairness in the business models that underpin open research communications channels is critical for us. And the final thing that I want to talk about is that in the same spirit of thinking about equity and openness in the channels that support journal publications, the infrastructure in general that we use in the scholarly research environment also needs to be open to a great degree and to be what we call community-owned or community-controlled infrastructure. And I'm thinking specifically about institutional repositories in this regard. Many people will be familiar with the recent acquisition of the institutional repository platform, bPress, by Elsevier Science. And in and of itself, it's fine. It was a commercial company acquired by another commercial company. We shouldn't have been surprised in the library community and the research community when this acquisition took place. And yet, the alarm bell that it rang in many libraries' heads was that this platform that we rely on in our libraries to freely and openly share articles that are produced on our campus is no longer ours. It's owned by a commercial entity. And that may or may not be problematic, but ownership of that channel is something that we took for granted, I think, in the library community, as it would always be part of the open landscape. And we need to be sure that we're being smart about the terms and conditions that we're negotiating with commercial vendors of infrastructure to make sure that the ownership and the openness of that infrastructure remains intact, even if the ownership transfers to commercial players who are not going anywhere. They're going to be part of the landscape, and they will be. We need to be smarter about the ways that we think about working with them. And finally, and probably most importantly, we really need to continue to build collaborative strategies that reflect the global nature of the research enterprise, right? To go back to that basic tenet of, if we could reimagine the system from the ground floor up to optimize the system of sharing research for all folks involved, what would it look like? We need to keep asking ourselves that question and keep answering it together, and then working towards building a system that uses open as an effective enabling strategy to help us achieve goals that we share. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have a little time. We have 5 more minutes. Maybe we can entertain some questions from the floor. Anyone from the library side? Librarians, you can also make your comment, not just the questions.
Thank you for nice talk. So and I'm wondering, so now, so quick, so like emergence of wide use of preprint server. So yeah, because preprint server is a long history, but so recently very at, at 10 years ago something very limited domain. So but now its domain is splitting out. So how do you locate like a preprint server in such open access landscape?
How do you locate a preprint server in the open access landscape if you're a researcher looking to put your article in, or if you're interested in finding the material, or both?
Yeah, because you like you mentioned like okay, we have to hold or control such open access environment. But print server is a now some print server is managed by communities, but others not. So that's some mixed situation now.
Yeah, it is a mixed situation in terms of who's controlling or owning preprint servers, and they need to, I think, follow your advice, right? That the ID is the infrastructure. We need to have DOIs for preprints. We need to have ORCID identifiers on the authors so that that material can be located on par with articles that are published in journals or articles that are in institutional repositories that are carrying DOIs. That the idea of identifiers as a critical piece of infrastructure, I think, rings right to the heart of what will make preprint servers successful.
Okay, so I mean the preprint server is also one of a key
Yes.
component of to make open access environment.
I think absolutely.
Oh, okay.
And it's a very encouraging sign that preprint servers, the use of preprint servers is going up. And it really, over the last 2 years, they've emerged as something outside of physics, which has always used preprint servers, archive, as something that's now, oh, okay, we can do this. There's a little bit of a behavioral change that's happening where researchers are beginning to think, it actually is beneficial for me to get my work out faster, and I'm not going to be, maybe I'm not rewarded for putting something in a preprint server yet, but I'm not going to be hurt by doing it. And that's a really important psychological step for behavioral change in the community.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question?
Just a quick point, going back to the idea of having you have a website, which people preface by we're going open in order to. Virtually all of the foci of the activity can be reduced to creating what is an externality. An externality is either a bad externality, like burning fossil fuel, or a good externality, like making public something which can be used by others. It's also making clean water available, so forth. There are a lot of things on which we depend, which are externalities, and they can't be brought within the calculus of the existing way of allocating resources. And so I think it's just important to know that there's a very large literature in economics which deals with the problems of trying to provide externalities which are good, and how to stop the generation of externalities which are bad. And these are not easy. This is not an easy terrain to work in, but I think you might reach out and find some of the leading people, or even the younger people who see an area of what has been learned in economics about externalities which are less lofty than some of the goals that you have in mind, and mechanisms which have been used to essentially elicit behavior which is beneficial to a large number of people, and involves some way of getting something back which will induce for the people who contribute to it something which is an externality of interest only to a small group. Okay, and so the question is, can you harness the activities of a small group which can do something by cooperating to get them to cooperate in a way that creates the externality for a very large group? And that's a great interesting approach to take. It's been taken. For example, people are working on fixing the climate problem by thinking about what mechanisms we use to fix the ozone hole. Okay,
and I think it's a great point. And there's two things I want to pull out of that. One is we are thinking about ways to do sort of demonstrations, right, of some of these things. And the idea of utilizing or working with younger researchers, early career researchers, is something that SPARC has a huge focus on. So we convene a yearly meeting of early career researchers from around the globe called OpenCon. Last year, we have about 200 participants each year. Last year, we had 13,000 young researchers from around the world apply to be part of the meeting. And we can only take 200, but we took 200 from 62 different countries. And they all came to the meeting, and part of the activity of the meeting was to identify something that they wanted to self-identify, something that they wanted to work on in groups, things that they had commonalities, that they wanted to look at utilizing open as an enabling strategy to move forward. And out of that meeting environment, we now have these not nascent, they're growing little groups of early career folks who are forming communities around using open as a way to advance progress in their specific discipline or interest area. And so I think it's a beginning, we didn't think about it using the roots of economic theory. We sort of looked at it as a community of practice and trying to build this community activity that way. But it's a tremendously, I think, important and fruitful way to think about things. Thanks. Yes.
いかがでしょう。Thank you. My question may not be so central focus of the talk, but I'm interested in if you have any finding of the open access practices in various countries in your experiences that the publication industries should have different culture, different industrial behaviors in the different countries, maybe, and based on the different legal systems. My focus is just in AGM, but if you have any example in the kind of the experience.
Yeah, I wouldn't presume to tell commercial publishers how to operate. I think they're very smart, and I'm sure they're looking at different operational modes in different countries. From our perspective, we are looking at different models that are working in different regions. So when we're looking for an alternative looking to find an alternative to article processing charges, for example, we're looking at the culture in Latin America of institutions supporting local content through institutional funding. There's not a culture of publication in large commercial journals or really a high emphasis on impact factor in Latin America, because there is a culture in many of the countries of valuing locally produced content, and the universities in perimeter is what's important, not the journal name. So kind of looking at those types of cultural differences as that's a positive, I think, exemplar to look at. We're also looking, though, really carefully at places where the production of local knowledge is not valued in the same way because they're asked to publish in high impact journals. We recently founded with colleagues a presence for SPARC in Africa. And in many of the countries, researchers are asked to publish in commercial journals or high impact journals, which use English as the primary language, which disadvantages researchers at the get-go. And second, the subject matter that's of interest to those journals is very different than the subject matter that's of import to many of the local researchers. There's not an interest in indigenous or local research. And that, our African colleagues call that the need to decolonize scholarly communications and scholarly publishing. Models that continue to move us in that direction are things that we're trying to pull and move away from.
Thank you.
All right, now it's time. Then let's finish up. Thank you very much.